My name is Nathan Barnes, and I haven't spoken about this in years. Not because I forgot, no, I couldn't forget if I tried. It's because every time I let the memory surface, I feel like something is still watching. And if I speak of it too often, I fear it might come back. It was the summer of 1997, and I was 26 years old. That was the last time I set foot in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Back then, hiking was my escape. The wild offered a kind of silence you can't find anywhere else, like stepping into another world. I craved that isolation, the kind where your thoughts are the only company you have. But looking back, I realized some places are meant to stay silent and undisturbed. That year, my best friend Mark Talbot and I decided to trek a remote trail through the Whites, away from the popular routes crowded with tourists. We planned for a 3-day hike, nothing too extreme, but enough to make us feel like we were out there alone, miles from anyone. We arrived at the trailhead early on a Friday morning. The sun barely kissed the horizon, and the mist clung to the forest like it didn't want to let go. The air was sharp with the scent of damp earth and pine, the kind of fresh that makes you feel small against the vastness of the woods. I remember Mark making some joke about bears as we laced our boots. I laughed, brushing it off, though I kept my hunting knife strapped to my hip. Not that I thought we would need it, but the forest can change on you fast, and I liked the weight of it against me reassuring. The first day was uneventful, a slow hike through dense thickets that occasionally opened to reveal sweeping views of the mountains stretching endlessly. There's a peace in that kind of isolation. But as the day wore on, something started gnawing at me like the forest wasn't as empty as it seemed. I shook it off. It was probably just the quiet messing with my head. By late afternoon, we reached a brook, its gentle babble filling the silence that had settled over us. We set up camp on a small clearing, built a fire, and cooked dinner. The flames flickered weakly against the growing darkness, and the shadows stretched long across the trees. Mark was the first to comment on it. "Notice how quiet it is?" he asked, poking at the fire with a stick. I had. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, distant calls of birds had faded. It was like the woods were holding their breath. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe they know something we don't. Mark grinned, but his eyes kept drifting toward the trees. We turned in early, but I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the branches sounded too close, and more than once, I thought I heard footsteps circling the edge of our camp. When I finally drifted off, I dreamt of nothing but darkness. We broke camp at dawn, but the weather had turned. The sun was little more than a pale disk behind thick clouds, and the air felt heavy. By noon, the trail had twisted into unfamiliar territory, and our map once so clear seemed useless. Mark swore we were still heading north, but the further we hiked, the more the forest felt wrong. The trees stood too close, and the ground felt softer, like it had been disturbed. At one point, I swore I saw movement through the trees. A figure, pale and thin, watching from a distance. When I turned to Mark, it was gone. I didn't mention it. As the afternoon bled into evening, the woods grew darker, shadows crawling under the trees long before sunset. Panic was beginning to set in. We hadn't seen a single trail marker in hours, and the thought of spending another night lost out here twisted my gut. Then Mark spotted it. "There," he said, pointing through the trees. I followed his gaze and saw it a cabin, tucked away in the clearing like it had been waiting for us. It was small, old, with weathered wood and a sloping roof. There was no path leading to it, no signs of life, but it was shelter. Relief flooded me. We practically stumbled toward it, eager for the promise of walls between us and the darkening woods. The door creaked as we pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was bare, a stone fireplace in the center, a wooden table, and 2 cots. Dust coated every surface, but the place felt solid. Mark laughed, the sound echoing in the emptiness. "See? Luck's on our side." I nodded, but something about the cabin felt off, like we were intruding. We settled in, using the fireplace to cook. As night fell, I felt it again, that sense of being watched. The windows, though caked with grime, seemed darker than they should have been, like something was pressing against the glass from outside. At one point, Mark stepped outside to check for firewood. When he returned, he looked pale. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I shook my head. Thought I heard someone calling. I laughed, but it felt hollow. Probably just the wind. But there was no wind that night. Morning came slow, and when it did, The cabin felt colder than before. Mark and I packed up quickly, eager to get moving. But when we stepped outside, the cabin wasn't there. I am not exaggerating. The clearing was empty, just trees and underbrush, as if the cabin had never existed. Mark swore, circling the clearing, kicking at the dirt. It was here. We didn't imagine it, but the ground where the cabin had stood was untouched. No footprints, no disturbed soil. I remember feeling like I couldn't breathe. The forest around us felt different, darker, like the trees had crept closer overnight. We left in a hurry, moving fast, barely speaking. By the time we found the main trail, the sun was setting again, and when we stumbled out of the woods near our car, I swore I saw the cabin through the trees one last time. But when I looked back, nothing. I haven't been back to the White Mountains since. Mark doesn't talk about it, and when I bring it up, he just shakes his head. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear that creaking door in my dreams. And when I wake, for just a second, I swear I can smell pine and old wood like the cabin's still waiting, somewhere out there in the trees. I was a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains back in 2003. My name is Nathan Caldwell. It's been over 20 years since that autumn. But not a day passes without me thinking about what happened. Some nights, I still hear the wind carrying faint voices, and even now, I refuse to hike alone. I tell myself it's caution, but deep down, I know the truth. Fear doesn't leave you. It just learns to sit quietly in the corner of your mind. I have always believed the mountains held secrets. The Smokies are older than memory itself, older than the paths carved through them. They stretch like ancient sentinels, watching silently, indifferent to the small lives that pass beneath their shadows. I felt that indifference every day I worked there. The forest doesn't care about you. If you listen too closely, you'll hear it whisper that truth. The story I am about to tell you isn't one I have shared often. I have mentioned bits and pieces over the years, but the full weight of it, the dark, unrelenting heaviness, has stayed with me alone. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's because no one wants to believe something like this could happen in a place so beautiful. It started on a cold October morning. I remember the sky was slate gray, and the mist clung to the trees like spider silk. A small group of hikers signed in at the Deep Creek trailhead. Two couples, Mark and Dana, along with Eric and his girlfriend Rachel. Young, energetic, the kind of people who brought brand new gear and wore hiking boots that still looked fresh out of the box. They didn't stand out at the time. Just another group looking for an adventure before the cold set in for good. The Smokies have that effect on people. They draw you in, make you feel like you're part of something bigger. The four of them were planning to hike about 10 miles in and camp overnight. Nothing too extreme, but far enough that they'd be away from the main trails. There was nothing out of the ordinary when they left. They laughed, joked around, and took photos at the sign like everyone else. I remember Rachel had a bright red jacket that practically glowed against the muted tones of the forest. By Saturday night, they should have been back. When they didn't return, no one was too worried at first. People misjudge their timing all the time. Maybe they camped longer, took a different route. It happens. But when Sunday afternoon came and there was still no sign of them, we were sent to check their route. That's when we found the campsite. It was tucked just off the trail, in a clearing that overlooked the valley. The tents were still standing, unzipped but untouched. The fire pit was cold, though a stack of unused wood sat beside it. Their bags were there, fully packed, leaning against a fallen log. But there was no sign of Mark, Dana, Eric, or Rachel. I remember walking around the campsite, calling their names. Birds chirped in the distance, leaves crunched beneath my boots. But otherwise, it was silent. Too silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then I saw it. A journal, lying face down in the dirt beside one of the tents. It wasn't soaked, so it hadn't been there long. I knelt down, brushing the leaves off the cover. The leather was soft and worn, the kind of thing you buy at a roadside gift shop. When I opened it, I saw neat handwriting in black ink. It was Dana's journal. Most of the entries were normal. Details about the hike, inside jokes, comments about the scenery. But the last entry, that's what stopped me cold. It was short. They have been following us for hours now. I thought it was just animals at first, but now I know better. Mark doesn't believe me. He says we're imagining things, but Rachel hears them too. I don't know how much longer we can keep going. They know we see them. I am sure they know. I read it twice, then 3 times. The edges of the page were smudged as if Dana's hand had shaken while she wrote. I didn't want to believe it, but something about that entry felt wrong. Uncomfortably real. We searched until nightfall, but there was no sign of them. No footprints leading away from the campsite. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. The next day, we expanded the search. More rangers, more volunteers. I remember watching them fan out across the woods, calling names that disappeared into the trees without echo. Midway through the afternoon, one of the volunteers, an older man named Henry, found something about a mile from the campsite. He was pale, shaking as he led me to it. It was a pile of rocks, carefully stacked, almost like a cairn, and wedged beneath them was Mark's watch, still ticking. The strap had been cut clean through. I have been a ranger for a long time. I've found lost hikers, stumbled across remains that had been out there far too long. But something about this. It felt deliberate. Personal. That evening, we set up camp near the site. There were 5 of us. No one said it out loud, but none of us wanted to be alone. The woods changed as the sun set. The shadows stretched longer than they should have. The trees creaked and groaned as if something unseen shifted beneath their roots. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps just beyond the edge of the clearing. Slow, deliberate. I stayed perfectly still, listening as the steps circled our camp once, twice, then stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By the 5th day, the search was officially called off. There was no evidence of animal attack, no sign of a struggle. It was as if the 4 of them had simply walked away. But I knew better. I didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. But the mountains don't care what you believe. They hold their secrets close. And if you're not careful, you might become one of them. A week after the search ended, I hiked back to the site alone. I don't know why. Maybe I needed closure. Maybe I thought I could find something everyone else had missed. I found the journal exactly where I left it, half buried under leaves. I flipped to the last page again, my hands cold, despite the sun overhead. Beneath Dana's final entry, there was something new. 4 words, scrawled in dirt across the paper. Now they know too. I haven't been back to Deep Creek since. That was a final decision. I have never been one for ghost stories. I always chalked them up to superstition or overactive imaginations. But what happened to me and my wife at Palo Duro Canyon last fall changed everything. I haven't told many people about it, mainly because I don't want to relive it. But maybe writing it down will help. We had been planning the trip for months. Rachel, my wife, had been dying to take the RV out for a weekend, and the weather was perfect. Palo Duro Canyon was supposed to be breathtaking that time of year. Crisp autumn air, burnt orange foliage, and just enough chill at night to make campfires worthwhile. We pulled into the campground late Friday afternoon. The sun was dipping below the canyon rim, casting long shadows over the rugged terrain. There weren't many other campers around, just a few scattered RVs and tents in the distance. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The kind of quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat. Rachel and I set up our site, grilled some burgers, and sat by the fire as the stars blinked into the darkening sky. The wind whispered through the canyon walls, carrying a faint, distant echo that seemed to shift direction every few moments. Rachel joked that it sounded like someone humming. I brushed it off, told her it was probably just the wind playing tricks. By midnight, we crawled into the RV, both exhausted from the drive and a little buzzed from the wine. Rachel fell asleep almost instantly. I lay awake, listening to the sounds outside. The crackling fire had dwindled to glowing embers, and the hum of the wind was now punctuated by something else. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was an animal. Maybe a coyote or a deer sniffing around the site. But the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It circled the RV, slow and steady. Gravel crunched under each step, one after another, like someone pacing. I didn't want to wake Rachel. She had a tendency to panic, and I figured it would pass. But after 15 minutes of that slow, relentless circling, I couldn't take it anymore. I quietly slid out of bed, grabbed the flashlight, and peeked through the small window by the kitchenette. Nothing. The firelight barely reached the edge of the RV. But beyond that, there was just darkness. I opened the door, stepped outside, and shined the flashlight around the site. The beam cut through the night, illuminating the trees and the empty picnic table. Still, nothing. The footsteps had stopped. I stood there for a few minutes, waiting for something, anything to emerge from the shadows. But the only sound was the wind scraping against the canyon walls. Finally, I locked the RV and climbed back into bed, telling myself it was just my imagination. I woke up to Rachel screaming. She was standing by the RV door, her hand trembling as she pointed at the window. The glass was smeared with handprints, long, pale smudges that stretched across the entire pane. Dozens of them. Some small, like a child's. Others larger, more defined. But they were everywhere, crisscrossing in patterns that made no sense. "Did you do this?" Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper, but I could hear the terror in it. "Why would I do that?" I snapped, stepping closer to inspect the prints. They weren't ours. The smears were greasy, almost translucent, as if the hands that made them were damp. I pressed my palm against one, measuring the size. It was larger than mine by at least an inch. I checked the door. Locked. Same with the windows. There was no sign of forced entry. Whoever had left those prints had done it from the outside, but there were no footprints in the dirt beneath the window. Nothing. Rachel wanted to leave immediately. I can't blame her. But I convinced her to stay, at least until sunrise. We spent the next few hours huddled together, every creak of the RV making us jump. When the first light bled over the canyon, I stepped outside again. The handprints were gone. Not just faded or washed away. Gone. As if they had never been there at all. Rachel swore up and down that she hadn't imagined them, and I knew better than to doubt her. We packed up and left that morning, cutting our trip short. Weeks passed, and we tried to forget about it. But Palo Duro stayed with us. Rachel refused to camp anymore, and I started triple-checking the locks at night. Sometimes, when the wind picks up, I hear footsteps outside our house. I tell myself it's nothing. But some nights, when I look out the window, I swear I see faint smudges on the glass. They're not there in the morning. It was May 2021 when I decided to camp by Lake Mead. I don't know what drew me there, not really. Maybe it was the vague memory of a childhood trip, the image of the water shimmering in the desert heat, or the way it felt like the kind of place where the world couldn't touch you. But what I do know is that I wish I'd never gone. The RV rattled and groaned as I maneuvered it down the dirt path leading to the lake. The landscape around me was barren, almost hostile. Scraggly bushes and jagged rocks dotted the terrain, and the air felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't just the heat. It was something else. Something I couldn't quite place. Like a shadow looming just outside your peripheral vision. By the time I reached the lakeshore, the sun was already sinking behind the horizon, its red-orange light spilling across the water. The lake stretched out before me, impossibly vast, its surface unnaturally still. It wasn't peaceful. It was dead. The moment I stepped out of the RV, the silence hit me. Not the kind of quiet you would expect in a remote place, where you might hear the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of wind through the trees. No. This was a silence that pressed against you, that seemed to suck the sound out of the world. Even my own footsteps felt muffled as I walked to the water's edge. I stood there for a while, staring out at the lake. There wasn't a soul in sight. Not a single boat, no other campers, nothing. It didn't make sense. Lake Mead was supposed to be a popular spot, wasn't it? The thought flickered through my mind, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was just an off-season thing, I told myself. It was as I was heading back to the RV to set up camp that I saw him. A man, standing on the far side of the clearing, just where the dirt path disappeared into the shadows. He wore a tattered jacket and a wide-brimmed hat, the kind fishermen might wear to shield themselves from the sun. But his face was what caught my attention. Or rather, the lack of it. The light was fading fast, and his features were obscured, like they were wrapped in shadow. But his eyes seemed to gleam unnaturally, reflecting the dim light in a way that wasn't right. "Evening," he called out, his voice carrying across the clearing like a whisper that somehow felt louder than it should. I froze, a primal unease washing over me. I hadn't heard him approach. There was no crunch of gravel, no rustle of movement. He was just there. "Evening," I replied, forcing my voice to sound casual, though my throat felt dry. "You camping out here?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "Yeah," I said. "Just for the weekend?" He nodded slowly, his head bobbing like it was on a loose hinge. "You fish?" "Sometimes," I said. He pointed a long, bony finger toward the water. "Good spot just past the bend there. Big ones." There was something off about the way he said it, like he was reciting lines in a play he didn't fully understand. I nodded, muttered a quick thanks, and turned back toward the RV. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was gone. Despite the unease gnawing at me, I decided to check out the spot he mentioned. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the kind of curiosity that gets you killed in bad horror movies. Either way, I grabbed my gear and followed the shoreline toward the bend he'd pointed to. The path was narrow and uneven, the kind of trail that feels like it's been forgotten by time. The further I went, the darker it got, the moonlight barely piercing through the thickening shadows. When I finally reached the spot, I saw what he meant. The water here was deeper, darker, its surface like polished obsidian. I cast my line and waited, the silence around me feeling heavier with each passing minute. That's when I heard it. A faint splash, like something breaking the surface of the water. I squinted, peering out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, but then, movement. A ripple, subtle but deliberate, cutting through the still water. And then, I saw him. The fisherman. He was out there, standing waist-deep in the water, his wide-brimmed hat unmistakable. His head was tilted back, as if he were looking up at the sky, but there was something wrong with his posture. His shoulders were rigid, his arms hanging limply at his sides. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaky. "You all right?" He didn't respond. I took a step closer, my boots sinking into the soft mud. "Hey!" I shouted again. And then he turned. But it wasn't a normal turn. His body twisted in a way that made my stomach look right, like his spine was bending in directions it shouldn't. His head snapped toward me, and even from that distance I could see his eyes. They weren't reflecting the moonlight anymore. They were glowing. I don't remember running back to the RV. It's all a blur. Branches clawing at my arms, the ground slipping beneath my feet, the sound of my own ragged breathing drowning out everything else. When I finally slammed the door shut behind me, I locked it and collapsed against it, my heart hammering in my chest. The silence had returned, but it wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. I peered out the window, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of him. The clearing was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the RV, every whisper of wind against the metal shell, set my nerves on edge. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I mustered the courage to look, there was nothing there. The next morning, I drove into the nearest town, desperate to shake the unease that clung to me. I stopped at a small diner, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. Over a cup of bitter coffee, I mentioned the fisherman to the waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes. Her face paled. "Lake Mead's been closed for months," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean, closed?" I asked. "Since the accident," she said. "A boat capsized out there last year. They never found the guy who went missing. Fisherman named Paul wore a wide-brimmed hat, always fished the same spot near the bend." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What happened to him?" She shrugged, her expression grim. "Some say he drowned. Others say he's still out there, looking for someone to take his place." I didn't finish my coffee. I didn't even say goodbye. I just left. The image of the fisherman burned into my mind. I haven't been back to Lake Mead since. I sold the RV, moved to a different state, and tried to forget. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about the lake. In my dreams, I am back at the water's edge, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. And in the distance, I see him, standing waist deep in the water, his glowing eyes locked onto mine. And then, I wake up, drenched in sweat, the sound of his voice echoing in my ears. Good spot past the bend there. Big ones. And I know, deep down, that one day, I will hear that voice again. But next time, I won't wake up. Some nights, when the world is quiet and the shadows seem to stretch a little longer than they should, I hear his voice soft, close, like he's standing right behind me. I know what you did, Lucas. I know everything. It has been 8 years, and I still wake up drenched in sweat, my throat raw from screaming. I don't know if what I saw was real, but I know it was something I was never supposed to encounter. You can tell yourself all you want that ghosts aren't real, that people who vanish into thin air are nothing but stories to scare kids. But if you've been with me on that dark stretch of road near Pismo Beach in September 2016, you wouldn't be so sure. Let me take you back to that night exactly as I remember it. My family and I had been driving up the California coast for days. The RV rattled and groaned with every mile, the engine making a sound like it didn't want to be there any more than I did. It was supposed to be a peaceful, twice-a trip. Jenna, my wife, thought it would be good for us. A chance to recharge, she had said. And Adam, our 8-year-old son, loved the idea of sleeping in a house on wheels. Me? I just went along with it. The trouble started late, around midnight. We had parked the RV on a quiet pull-off a few miles outside of Pismo Beach. It was one of those lonely stretches of road, with cliffs on one side and black ocean on the other, the kind of place where headlights only find emptiness when they cut through the dark. I had stepped outside to smoke a cigarette, leaving Jenna and Adam asleep inside. The wind was colder than it should have been for September. It carried the sharp scent of salt and something else I couldn't place. Something metallic, like rusted iron. As I stood there, staring out into the inky black of the ocean, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate. A rhythmic crunch of gravel under boots. I froze, my cigarette hanging from my lips. I hadn't heard a car pull up, and there was no one else around for miles. But the footsteps kept coming. I turned around, expecting to see some late-night traveler, maybe another camper. Instead, I saw him. The hitchhiker. He was standing a few feet away, silhouetted against the RV's dim yellow light. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could see enough. He was tall, lanky, and his clothes hung off him like they didn't quite fit. A tattered gray hoodie, ripped jeans, and boots that looked like they'd walked through hell and back. His hands were shoved into his pockets, his posture oddly still, like he was trying not to scare me. "You got a light?" he asked. His voice was low, rough, like he hadn't used it in years. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the creeping unease crawling up my spine. Yeah, sure. My hands were trembling as I pulled out my lighter and flicked the flame to life. The hitchhiker stepped closer, just enough for me to see his face. His skin was pale, almost gray, like he hadn't seen sunlight in months. His eyes. God. His eyes were what I remember most. They were too wide, too bright, and the irises seemed to shimmer in the light, like oil floating on water. He grinned a slow, unnatural smile that didn't reach those shimmering eyes. "Thanks, Lucas." I froze. My heart stopped mid-beat. "How do you know my name?" He just stared at me, unblinking. That horrible grin still stretched across his face. I took a step back, my mind racing. Maybe he had seen the RV. Maybe Jenna or Adam had mentioned my name earlier. That made sense, didn't it? But deep down, I knew there was no way. Jenna and Adam had been asleep for hours. "It's a nice family you've got in there," he said, nodding towards the RV. "Jenna and Adam, right?" I dropped the cigarette, my pulse thundering in my ears. I could feel the blood drain from my face. "Who the hell are you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his boots grinding against the gravel. The wind picked up, whistling through the cliffs, but I swear it sounded like whispering low voices carried on the air, speaking words I couldn't understand. I stumbled back toward the RV, fumbling for the door handle. I wanted to run, to slam the door in his face and pretend I hadn't just spoken to something that shouldn't exist. But when I looked up, he was gone. Vanished. There was no sound, no footsteps, no movement. Just the empty stretch of road and the wind screaming through the dark. I climbed back into the RV and locked the door behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely twist the deadbolt. I stood there in the dark for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. The wind howled outside, and the RV creaked in response. I turned to check on Jenna and Adam, half expecting to see that hitchhiker standing over them, but they were still sound asleep. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the driver's seat with my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, watching for any sign of movement. Morning came slowly, the sun creeping over the horizon like it didn't want to be there either. I convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. That maybe I'd been too tired, or maybe the darkness had played tricks on me. We packed up and hit the road early. Jenna was in good spirits, humming along to some song on the radio, and Adam sat in the back, flipping through a comic book. I kept my eyes on the road, my fingers white-knuckled on the steering wheel. Every so often, I would glance at the side mirrors, half expecting to see that pale face grinning back at me. And then I saw him. We were halfway to Monterey, driving through a long stretch of empty highway, when I caught a glimpse of something in the distance. A figure standing by the side of the road, his thumb stuck out in that universal hitchhiking gesture. It was him, the same gray hoodie, the same two wide eyes. "Lucas!" Jenna's voice made me jump. I glanced over at her, trying to hide the terror on my face. "Yeah? Did you see that guy back there?" My mouth went dry. I nodded. "Yeah, I saw him. He looked weird, didn't he?" I didn't answer. I didn't answer. I couldn't. We drove on in silence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, watching us. That night, we stopped at a crowded RV park near Monterey, surrounded by families and laughter. It should have felt safe. It didn't. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a faint tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft, like fingernails against glass. I sat up, my heart pounding. The RV was dark, Jenna and Adam still fast asleep. I listened, straining to hear over the blood rushing in my ears. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. I turned my head slowly, the air feeling thick and heavy, like I was moving underwater. He was there. The hitchhiker stood just outside the window, his face inches from the glass. His skin was paler than before, almost translucent, and his grin was wider. Too wide. His teeth were sharp and gleaming, like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "I told you, Lucas. I know everything." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just sat there, staring into those impossible eyes as the tapping continued. Tap, tap, tap. And then he was gone. The next morning, I told Jenna we were cutting the trip short. I made up some excuse about work, but I think she could tell something was wrong. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there, to put as many miles as possible between us and whatever that thing was. We made it back home in 2 days. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, I found a photograph tucked under the windshield wiper of my truck. It was a picture of the RV. Our RV parked on that lonely pull-off near Pismo Beach. In the corner of the photo, you could see a figure standing in the shadows. The hitchhiker. That was 8 years ago. I moved my family to a different state. I changed my job, my routines, everything I could think of to shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting. But every so often, I catch a glimpse of something. A figure by the side of the road, or a shadow where there shouldn't be one. And sometimes, late at night, I hear it again. Tap, tap, tap. And I know he's still watching.